Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for our final webinar in our sheep feeding webinar series. Tonight's webinar is on ration balancing, whether using a Pearson square, which is calculations by hand, or using a ration balancing software, and I'm going to be using SheetBytes tonight. So one point that I want to make right off the bat that I think is major and sometimes requires a little shift in our thinking is that sheep don't need ingredients. And this is true for really anything that we're feeding. They need the nutrients that those feeds are supplying in bioavailable form, so meaning that their body is able to correctly absorb them and use them in the right amounts. So a sheep, they've got no requirement for barley or corn or silage or hay. So what they really need is what those feeds are supplying. So the energy, the protein, for example, the calcium, the copper, the vitamins, the fiber, and everything else that those are going to supply. So this is why it's a little bit tricky when somebody just asks point blank, how many pounds of grain do I need to feed my sheep? It really depends on what's already being supplied. So ration balancing is making sure that we're providing a diet that's going to meet all of an animal's nutritional requirements for the stage of production that we're feeding for. So we're taking all of those things into account, like dry matter content, energy content, protein, and the vitamins and minerals. So my favorite way to balance a ration is to start with the most appropriate forage that we have for the group that we're feeding. So in order to begin with our forage, we have to know what we have. So we have to test our forages. Hopefully I've conveyed this in my other webinars. You really can't balance a ration any other way. Your forages are highly variable, so it's something that's important that you do every year, because even if you've tested in previous years, there's no guarantee that the forage that you have this year is anything remotely similar to the forage that you had last year. There's so many things throughout the year that affect forage quality, such as moisture content, temperature, time of cutting, and other things. So it's really important that we do this every year so that we can provide a balanced diet. So submitting a feed sample, it takes maybe an hour or two of your day once a year. So it's really easy. It's just something that you have to go out and do. So the local lab in Truro, they need approximately a sandwich bag worth of forage in order to analyze a sample. So if you've got 5 different types of forages that you want to submit, you'd be submitting 5 different sandwich baggies worth of forage. So there is a proper way to collect it to make sure that it's going to be a representative sample. This is going to involve using a forage probe and a drill. So I believe the NSDA offices all will have these that producers can borrow. Here at Perennia, we also have some that we will loan out. And if you have any more questions or you need more details on the actual steps that go into submitting a feed sample, please reach out. I'd be happy to help. So once you've submitted your feed sample to the lab, you're going to get a feed test report back that's going to explain the quality of your feed and what's in it. And it does come back with quite a few numbers, so if it's the first time that you're looking at a feed test, it can be a bit overwhelming because there is a lot there. But it really is fairly straightforward once you know what you're looking for. So there's 3 main things that I always look at first when I'm assessing feed quality, and those are the dry matter content, the crude protein content, and then the total digestible nutrients. So that'll be listed as TDN. So this is basically the energy fraction of the diet. So you'll get back something that looks like this. So you'll see that there's 2 columns. There's as fed and dry. So dry, that's that dry matter basis. This is what we're going to compare all our feeds to. So this is what's left after we take out all the moisture. So this allows us to compare different feeds together. So this is the only part that I'm paying attention to right now, highlighted in yellow, and I'm going to totally ignore everything in this as fed column other than dry matter. So those 3 main things that I'm looking at are the dry matter content, which is 63.33%, the crude protein content, which is almost 17%, and then the TDN, so that's the energy, and that's 68%. So the dry matter is going to tell you, it's going to be a pretty good indication of quality. So especially if it's silage, for example. So moisture levels that are outside of sort of the 30 to 70% range, they might not have been siled properly because they were too dry, or they might have had excess seepage if they're too wet. And it's also going to tell you what stage of production that it's best suited for. So if you'll remember from a previous webinar, I mentioned that ewes who are in their late gestation, they're going to need drier feeds. So this is how we're going to tell what's our drier feeds that are suitable for those groups. The crude protein, this is also a good indicator of quality, but it's really useful for matching up the stage of production that we're going to save that feed for. So just a refresher, ewes in their maintenance period, they need 9% crude protein. And then ewes who are in their early lactation, who are nursing twins, they need 15% crude protein. So for example, this feed, lots of crude protein, so I would definitely feed this to my ewes in early lactation. It would be a waste if I fed this out to my ewes who were in their maintenance period. And then just a quick refresher of this graph of the various relative nutritional requirements of ewes across their stages of production. And then this should be a reminder as well. So this is a condensed version of the NRC requirements that the University of Cornell has come up with. And I will pop the link to this in the chat. So this is a really handy way to get information about different requirements that your ewes and your lambs have during their different stages of production. So again, these numbers, they can seem kind of overwhelming at first when you're first looking at it. But it is, once you know what you're looking for, it's very easy to use. So the process of figuring out how much I'm actually going to need to supply to my animals, the first step is to identify the group. So I'm going to pretend that I've got a group of mature Rito Dorset crossbred ewes, and they're in their late gestation, and that's the ration that I want to put together for them. And their average weight, I'm going to say they're 150 pounds and they're in fair condition or a body condition score of 3. So I look on the chart and I find the last 4 weeks of gestation, and it's going to tell me the TDN percentage that they need. So that's the energy, and then the crude protein amount that they need for that. So that's 11.3. So I know that when I'm coming up with this total ration, I want something that's dry because they're in their late pregnancy. They've got a reduced rumen capacity, so if I can feed them something drier, then that's going to help them to maintain their feed intake. I want to supply them something that's around 11.5% crude protein, and then something that's around 65% energy. So I'm going to pretend that these are the 3 feed options that I have. I tested them. These are actually feed samples that have come from producers' fields this past year in Nova Scotia. So I'm looking at those 3 main things that I mentioned previously: dry matter content, crude protein, and TDN to simplify my selection process. So right off the bat, I can see that barley, it's really wet. I'm not going to choose this because my ewes are probably going to have a hard time eating enough to maintain their nutritional requirements. So I'm going to scratch that off straight away. So now I'm looking between the first cut and the second cut silage. So I'm looking here at the first cut. So I noticed that this is my driest feed. So that would be, if I was totally basing this on dry matter content, this is what I would choose. But it's also my best quality in terms of the highest protein and energy. And thinking ahead, I know that once those ewes lamb, this is when they have their highest nutritional demands. So they've got the highest demand for protein and energy. So the second cut here, if I didn't have enough of this first cut and I had to feed out the second cut, I wouldn't be meeting their protein requirements, although I would be meeting their energy requirements. So I would have to supplement this second cut. So I would choose to save this, this first cut for early lactation so that I wouldn't have to supplement if I didn't have enough of it to feed for both periods. So just something to keep in mind, that I would have to really monitor them if I'm feeding them the second cut during their late gestation. just to make sure that they are maintaining their intake. So ideally I would want this drier, but you have to work with what you have. So I would try this out just so that I can try to save from having to supplement that protein once they're in their early lactation. So I'm going to move into actually balancing a ration. So this is a Pearson square, so this is a hand calculation. So I'm going to pretend that with my forages from my previous example, I'm going to feed that the second cut to my ewes who are in their early lactation. So just a reminder that they are going to need 15% protein, and this forage is only supplying about 14%. And they need 65% energy, and my forage alone is supplying this. So I don't have enough protein, so I'm going to have to supplement this. So I need something that's going to bring my protein levels in the total diet up from 13.9% up to 15%. And the only way that I can do this is using something that's going to contain more than 15% crude protein, which just makes sense if you think about it. So here are some common protein sources and the typical protein content of them. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose that ewe chow, so that's 16% crude protein, to try to boost the protein of my second cut haylage. So this is a Pearson square. So how it works is you put your first input up at the top here, and I'm balancing protein, so I'm going to list the protein content up here, and then down here I'm going to list my second feed choice, so the ewe chow, and it's got 16% crude protein. And so then in my box here I'm going to write down my target crude protein amount, so that's 15%. And so what you're doing across the square is you're going to be subtracting. So starting here up at this corner, so I'm going to do 13.9% minus 15, and I'm going to get 1.1, and you just, when you're doing this, you ignore any negatives. And then from this corner, working up to the top, so I've got 16 minus 15 leaves me with 1. So this is the different ratios of the diets. So I've got 1 part haylage to 1.1 part ewe chow will give me a diet that has 15% crude protein. So I'm going to add 1.1 plus 1 to give me 2.1 total parts. And then with this, I can calculate the exact percentage of the diets that'll give me this. So 47.6% haylage with the 52.4% ewe chow will give me a diet that's 15% crude protein. So I would need more than 52% of the total ration of ewe chow to meet the protein needs of our sheep during this period. So that is a lot of supplementing. That's going to be expensive. So maybe I'm going to look at something that's got more protein so that I can feed less of it. So exact same process, except this time I'm going to use whole soybeans instead of ewe chow, which have 38% crude protein. So ideally I'm going to have to feed less of it. So it's the same process. I'm just subtracting along the diagonals to figure out the different parts of the diet. Then I'm going to add those parts together to give me my total parts, and then use that to figure out the relative percentage. So for this, I need to feed less than 5% soybeans to bump up my protein levels to 15%. So if I'm going to use whole soybeans as the protein supplement, I'm only going to need to feed 4.6 of the total diet as soybeans, just because they do contain that much more protein than ewe chow does. So if my ewe is 150 pounds, and if she's going to be eating 3% of her body weight in dry matter per day, so that's what the rough estimate is, it's 2 to 3% of body weight, and since she's in a highly productive part of her stage of production, I'm going to say she's going to be eating 3%. So I'm going to expect her to eat 4.5 pounds of dry matter per day. And since soybeans are really dry, I'm not going to factor their dry matter content into account. I'm just going to make a rough estimation that 4.6% of 4.5 pounds that's the total dry matter she's going to eat, and then 4.6% of this is about 1/5 of a pound, or 95 grams per day. So then the rest of that diet is going to be approximately 4.3 dry matter of that second cut haylage. And because I can't just say that she needs 4.3 pounds of that haylage, because it does contain a lot of moisture, and this is on a dry matter basis. So knowing this and knowing the dry matter content and the water content of this haylage, that means that I need to feed her approximately 9 pounds of that per head per day, in addition to the 1/5 of a pound of the whole soybeans. And that would give me a diet that's 15% crude protein, and it would meet her needs during early lactation. So this is something that you can use for simple 2-ingredient calculations to balance things like protein, energy. If you've got a specific vitamin or mineral that you want to target, this is a useful calculation. So now that we're able to calculate how much that we need in order to supplement our forage, I think this illustrates really nicely the value of feed tests. So I'm just going to pretend that I've got those two, the first cut and the second cut feed tests that I explained previously, and I'm trying to decide between them. Let's pretend that I haven't done any feed tests. All I know is that I've got first cut and I've got second cut, and I'm going to feed my ewes, but I don't know the quality, other than the assumption that second cut is going to be higher in protein. It's taken later in the year, the legumes would have a greater percentage of that forage. So that's the assumption that I'm going to make, but it's wrong, and I wouldn't know that unless I actually tested the forage. Oops. So if I selected that second cut forage to feed to my ewes in the early lactation under the assumption that it's got more protein, I'm going to end up having to feed 2¼ pounds per head per day of ewe chow to my ewes to go along with that second cut forage, to make sure that they are still performing how I need them to. So when you actually calculate it out of how much ewe chow that is, you can figure out the price per kilo or the price per pound. You know how much you have to feed them per day, and then you can figure out how much it's going to cost to feed 30 ewes for 6 weeks. So just over $900. If I had just submitted the feed samples to the lab, which is $40 for unregistered farms or $20 for registered farms, then I would have had that knowledge to switch it and to feed my first cut haylage during that early lactation, because then I wouldn't have to supplement this protein. So it can save you hundreds of dollars by submitting those feed tests and knowing what you actually have, and not having to spend that money on supplementing if you don't have to, if it's just a matter of feeding that forage at the most appropriate time. And again, if anyone needs any information on submitting feed samples, or they want help learning how to use the forage probe or the drill, please reach out. I would be very happy to assist. And now switching gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about ShapeBytes, which is a ration balancing software. So this is something that you would use if you wanted to do some more in-depth ration balancing. If you had more than two ingredients that you wanted to look at, or you wanted to focus on the diet as a whole rather than individual parts of the diet, like protein, for example. So it's run by the Alberta Lamb Producers. It does require a yearly subscription, so it's $100 for that first year for a personal subscription, and then subsequent years after that, it's $50 for renewal, and it runs in your internet browser, so you don't have to download any programs onto your computer. So it's stored online in a database. So I have access to a commercial subscription, so I'm actually not sure how this is going to compare to the personal subscription, but I assume it's very similar. But when you first open up SheetBytes and you start a new ration, you would see something like this. So the first step is to input the details of the class of animal that you want to make a ration for. So you go over, toggle over, and you click on animal, and you're going to see a page like this that pops up. So you're going to be able to select the class of animal. So I'm just going to click on this, and I'm going to pretend that I've got a group of finishing lambs. So I'm going to select this option. I'm going to pretend they're a medium-sized breed, and then I'm going to adjust their body weight and my target average daily gain. And I'm going to pretend they're in a good body condition score. So that's sort of the basics. If you want to add more details of the environment, you can do that, but just adding in the main details, that's the most important part. And then you can start to add the feeds that you want. So you would go across the top and you would select feeds. And they have a pretty comprehensive feed library that you can choose from. The best way to do it is to use your own feed test and modify the options that they have. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to click on silage. And one of the options that there is storing silage. So these are all different silages that I've inputted that are real reports that I've gotten from producers, and it allows me to save them. So as I'm going through the year, I can adjust as needed, which is really handy. But if you just scroll down a little bit, it's going to give you some preloaded options. So I'm going to go back to this second cut silage. So again, this is the one that's almost 14% crude protein. And I'm going to feed this to my lambs. So I want to choose one of the options that they have that closely matches up to this. So they report, there's two ways that you can report energy. So there's the net energy. So this is net energy maintenance and net energy for gain. But I've got TDN that's written on the feed report. So I'm just going to click on this light bulb, and it's going to switch the reporting into TDN. So now I've got TDN and protein, and I'm going to use those to find something that's similar. So again, 13.9% crude protein, and this option here, the clover grass silage, that looks pretty close. The protein is close, and just having that knowledge of what this actually is, I know that this is probably pretty close when it comes to like species composition, for example. This pea silage option here, it's better suited to the energy content, so it's 65% energy. But just having that knowledge that I have, I know that this haylage isn't pea silage, so I would choose this clover grass silage option instead. So I'm going to click on this add button, and then if I were to click on the ration toggle, I would see that that is now part of my ration. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to go across the top to edit. So this is going to allow me to change it so that it's more like the feed that I'm actually dealing with. So everything that I've highlighted here, I've edited so that it's based on my feed test report. And I'm going to click on save. So now we can see that energy content has been adjusted. And so I'm going back into my feed library, and I'm going over to mineral because I want to add that into my ration. And I've got this preloaded option here. So this is something that I've saved. This SureGain Premium Sheep Mineral, that's what I want to add. This is my standard go-to option. So I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to add some salt in as well. So I'm going to go over to the salt option, and I want to add some blue salt. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go back to my ration. So I can see here that it's telling me what the recommended dry matter intake is 1.56 kilos. So to my first step here is I'm going to select my silage, and I'm going to type that number in, 1.56. So this is on a dry matter basis. And I can see, oh, something's happened. So I am supplying the dry matter intake that my lambs are likely to eat. And then if I look along the bottom here, it's going to tell me if this is the total diet, how good this is at meeting the different nutrients that my lamb requires. So right off the bat, I can see that I'm looking at TDN, so energy. So it's telling me that the recommended nutrients, or the recommended amount of energy, is 1.3 kilos of TDN, but what's being supplied in my feed is 1.2, so it's going to flag this in red, so I know that it is below the threshold, so it's not meeting that target. Meanwhile, if I go over to protein, so this is reporting protein in grams, so it's recommended that my lambs get 144 grams of protein per day, but my ration, which is just silage at this point, it's way over that amount. So I'm in the red, but for a different reason, because I'm oversupplying the protein, but I'm undersupplying that, that energy. So one way that I can immediately fix this is if I dilute that protein by adding something into the ration that contains less protein to dilute that, but also contains more energy to bump up that energy level. So I tossed in some oats, so let's see what happens. So I'm going to just play around with the amounts. So I'm going to reduce the amount of silage and increase the amount of oats. So I'm still supplying with the recommended amount of the dry matter intake. And I should have mentioned this earlier. So if you get flagged green, that means that you're within the range that's acceptable. If you're flagged red, that means that you're outside of the boundary of what's acceptable, whether it's too low or too high. And then if it's flagged as yellow, then that's borderline. So it's acceptable, but you're approaching sort of the boundary where you might run into some trouble. So I can immediately see here that by reducing the amount of silage and by increasing the amount of oats, so I've reduced my protein content of this diet enough that it's no longer flagging me as being way too high, but my energy, I still can't get that up. So oats they don't contain as much energy as some other grains. So I think that I'm going to go ahead and try out a different grain, see what happens. Oh, sorry, I misspoke. I'm still playing around with the different amounts, so let's see if I can reduce the amount of silage and increase the amount of oats. And I'm still not meeting that, so my energy, I still can't get it quite high enough. So even though I've increased the amount, it's just that oats just don't contain enough energy for what I need. So I'm going to take that out of the ration. So I'm just going to select it and I'm going to go to remove feeds. It's going to ask me, are you sure? And I'm going to click on yes. And so then I went ahead and I added corn in its place, and I got that same amount, that 0.9 kilos of grain and 0.7 of silage. And now you can see that I do have enough energy. So I'm just barely under the target, but it's probably not super significant. So this corn works in a lot better. So I can see that some of my macronutrients, I'm meeting them now. So I'm hitting the dry matter intake. It's not really a requirement, but the estimated amount that my animal wants to eat. And I'm meeting the energy, I'm meeting the protein and the calcium and the phosphorus. So now I'm going to add in some mineral and try to balance my minerals. Oh, sorry, I misspoke. I've forgotten how I've set these slides up. So I'm just going to try to fine tune actually the amounts of corn to grain before I move on and start to add my mineral. So one thing that you'll notice here is that there is a toggle bar here that you can move over to see some more of those micronutrients. So I'm going to add in some salt. I'm just going to toss in an amount there, see what happens. So right off the bat, I can see that my iodine content has gone up. So I'm meeting the iodine content. I am meeting the cobalt amount requirement, and salt and sodium looks good too. So now I'm going to add in some of those, the mineral package. So I'm going to just toss in an amount there. And I can see that all of a sudden I'm starting to meet some of those requirements. And then I'm going to toggle back over to the front. So I do want to make a point here that it's very difficult to get a perfectly balanced ration. Oftentimes, like if you look here, my potassium is way oversupplied, but that's just a function of the amount of potassium that's in my forage. And there's nothing I can do about that. That it's in the forage. I have to use it up, so it is what it is. So some things like these micronutrients like calcium, if my calcium to phosphorus ratio was off, I would be concerned about that. But some of these other smaller micronutrients, if I'm oversupplying them, there's really not a whole lot I can do. And there are some things too that are really difficult to supply if I'm undersupplying them. So selenium, that's really difficult. So oftentimes these packages, they don't contain enough selenium that we need, even though they are at the maximum inclusion level. So in order to actually get the amount of selenium that we need, we might need to supplement it in other ways, or get a vet script to have something that's mixed up that contains those higher levels. And then I'm just going to play around with my numbers to try and tweak it a little bit. So I've just reduced the amount of corn, so my estimated dry matter intake is a little bit better. So then if you go along the top here to reports, you can click on quick report. Then it'll give you that ration in a way that's easy to implement. So you'll just scroll down here, and it'll give you a report that gives you on an as-fed basis. So this is the part that makes sense. So you're not having to figure out based on dry matter content how much you actually have to feed, but it'll tell you how much per head per day they need. It'll tell you the percent of that ration, and a really useful feature of SheetBytes is it'll tell you the cost per head per day to feed that ingredient. So these are just estimations, so this doesn't mean a whole lot, but you can go back and you can edit it so that the commodity prices reflect what you're actually paying. So I'm going to go back to my my corn, and I'm going to put in it's $400 per ton. And so now this is accurate. So based on the current prices of corn and based on the amount of my ration, it's going to cost me 37 cents per head per day if I want to feed corn. So you can use this to compare different feed options. So let's say that my lambs are 80 pounds right now and I want to sell them at 120 pounds. So they have to gain 40 pounds. And if it's going to cost me 37 cents per head per day to feed that corn, it's going to give me an estimation of how well they're going to grow on this ration. So it's predicting that my lambs are going to gain 0.77 pounds per day. So it's going to take 52 days for my lambs to gain 40 pounds. So 52 days times 37 cents means $19 per head to feed corn for that duration of time to get them up to that 120 pounds. So let's just pretend that I'm going to use oats instead, my previous option. And at the time that I was putting the slideshow together, so last week, they were $300 per ton. So I'll see here that my predicted average daily gain is lower, but also so is my cost to feed oats, which makes sense. So feeding oats is going to cost 30 cents per head per day. My predicted average daily gain is going to be lower. Again, this makes sense. So it's only going to be 0.68 of a pound. It's going to take them 59 days in order to gain that 40 pounds, but that works out to being $17.65 per head for them to gain that 40 pounds. So even though it's going to take me a week longer to grow them up to that target weight, it will be cheaper in the long run. And this doesn't always happen. Oftentimes corn or something that's more expensive, if it contains greater amounts of energy, the economics make sense to buy the more expensive input, just because I can use less of it and feed them for a shorter period of time. But you can't really know that unless you actually do these calculations and figure it out. So that's it for tonight, and I guess the end of my webinar series. But I guess the main takeaways that I'd like to leave you with would be to stop thinking in terms of ingredients and start thinking in terms of nutrients. Test your forages so that you can plan. And then ration balancing, it can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be. So whether all you're interested in doing is matching up the best forage use, or if you want to actually balance a diet using something like SheetBytes, unless you're actually testing that feed, you're just guessing. And this can be a really expensive mistake to make. So I really can't stress enough how much I recommend testing your feed every year and then planning, because it's going to improve the health of your animals, the economics of your business, and everything is just going to be a lot more efficient once this is something that is implemented and in place. And then lastly, I just want to thank you guys for sticking around, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.